Everybody had a good lunch? Yay. Just one quick announcement. All the sessions this afternoon are in here. We've all just picked up that Turnkey Solutions is allegedly in the product showcase. It's not. It's in here. So only today did we discover that. So anyway, well, I have great privilege. Our next speaker is someone I've known for probably a decade or more, and he's like most of us who work in simulation education, we all have multiple hats. We talked about that yesterday. Am I a simulation technologist? Am I an educator? So this afternoon's first speaker is Mr. Matthew Aldridge. One of his jobs is a senior lecturer at the University of Wolverhampton, and if you ever get a chance to go and visit that centre, please do. It's really fabulous. Plus he has to run on multiple sites, so if that's an issue for you. But today he's in his other hat, and I feel he should be wearing a chain or something. Matt is actually the European chapter president of, I call it Inacsl, but often Inacsl. I'm not going to explain exactly who they are because that will take what Matt's going to say, but they're having their main conference currently in Washington DC. So our vice president for European Inacsl is actually in Washington, so I don't know how you managed that, Matt. You sent the vice president to Washington, so we're very fortunate to have Matt. So Matt, welcome.
Thank you very much for the welcome, Mandy. Thank you very much for the invitation as well. I'm not quite sure where I should wear the chain. Do you think it was around the neck or around the leg, or I'm not quite sure. So I guess I can almost hear the collective inward groan when we mention the word standards. People are thinking, oh no, not another set of standards. I'm a healthcare professional, I've got professional regulatory body standards, I've got my own institution standards, you know, there's national standards. Why do we need more standards? Well, I think we all know why we need standards, because standards improve practice and they improve patient safety. And in particular in simulation, simulation has grown very organically, hasn't it, over the last, I've been involved in simulation for probably the last 17 years or so, and simulation has grown very organically from the bottom up. So there's lots of good practice out there, but there's also lots of variable practice, and that's where standards, I think, can really help us. So as Mandy said, my full-time substantive job is as a senior lecturer in adult nursing at the University of Wolverhampton, not too far from here in the Midlands. I've also got responsibility for academic lead for skills and simulation as well. I'm a nurse by background, an emergency nurse by background, and I've been involved in simulation for quite a while. I'm neither employed by Inacsl nor by CAE, so it's an entirely voluntary role, really. So what we're trying to look at then is, just as a show of hands, how many people have heard of Inacsl? I mean, you've all heard of them there because Mandy said the name, but who know who Inacsl are? Okay. Has anybody here used the Inacsl standards? Actually used them? Okay, so a few people again, that's good. Okay. So if you don't know what they are, by the aim of this session, I'm trying to tell you what they are and try and tell you how we might begin to operationalize them as well. I mean, what I will say is that this sort of session is normally a workshop that might last 2 hours or so. So I've got 30 minutes to kind of tell you really about a brief overview of the standards and how you might begin to use them as well. So the Inacsl standards are free for you to access. You can access them at inacsl.org. Go to the website, you can access them. You can access them in full there. You don't have to be a member of Inacsl to access the standards, but obviously being a member of Inacsl brings you extra benefits as well, and access to the journal Clinical Simulation in Nursing, which is an online simulation journal. You might also be thinking, well, in the name, the International Nursing Association for Clinical and Simulated Learning, well, that's nursing, isn't it? And I'm a medic, or I'm an ODP, or I'm a technician. That's nothing to do with me. Well, the Inacsl standards are interprofessional. Although nursing is in the title, Inacsl is an organization that was created for the furtherance of simulation in nursing. The standards are and can be used and have been used across a number of professions as well. There's a couple of references there to have a look at. Interestingly, I don't know if you know about the situation in America with the National Council of State Board for Nursing, but Inacsl were involved in a study that's been published about the use of simulation and how that might replace clinical time. And in actual fact, in America now, it is possible in undergraduate nursing programs to replace 50% of clinical time with simulation. 50%, yeah. Providing that those providers can map their standards against the Inacsl standards. We don't do that in the UK at the moment in terms of 50%. We're nowhere near that. But the Nursing and Midwifery Council, the regulatory body for nurses in the UK, we're currently under a draft proposal for new standards for pre-registration education. And there may well be changes to the amount of hours that people can use. And that's something to think about. So a little bit of a history of standards then. Inacsl were the first organisation globally to publish any standards in simulation. 2009, work first began on them. 2011, the first standards were published. 2013, revised standards were published. And coming up to the present date now, well, last year, 2016, the current standards were formatted and revised. So these are the current standards, the 2016 ones. And you can just see that the organisations that reviewed the standards, they were globally reviewed, so they were peer-reviewed globally, and there was involvement from a number of both professional bodies and other organisations as well. So what's new for the standards then? If you've seen them before, the changes in 2016 are new to you. If you've never seen them before, then they'll be new to you completely. But the new standards have got a new formatting. So we've removed the numbers from the standards as well. Previously they were numbered, and that might have inferred a hierarchical preference from 1, so at 2, 3, etc. The numbers have been removed, so it infers that no one standard is any more important than the other. Terminology has been replaced with glossary. And in actual fact now that we use the Society for Simulation in Healthcare's Global Healthcare Dictionary, which is also free for you to access from ssih.org. So that's an international simulation dictionary. And they've also been updated with the newest evidence as well. So there's the standards as you see them. And I'll just break them down individually. We'll talk about them briefly and then talk about how we might start to operationalise those in your own practice as well. So the first one then, although it's not hierarchical, this is just the first one that's come out, is simulation design. We all know that simulation design is really important. It shouldn't be done by accident. And you can see the standard is there. The standard is simulation-based experiences are purposefully designed to meet identified objectives and optimize achievement of expected outcomes. And then the criteria is how you're actually going to operationalise this. So we're thinking about things like, first of all, doing a needs assessment. So where do our simulation experiences come from? Do we just dream them up? Or should we think about root cause analysis? Should we think about adverse incidents? Should we think about curriculum of our healthcare students to plan where we're going to come up with these simulation episodes from? Thinking about objectives, thinking about the fidelity of the experience from low, medium or high. And again, what do we need to do? Very often when people come to me, they say, oh, I want to do a simulation on sepsis, and I want to do it with, a mannequin, either a high fidelity mannequin such as CA produce or Ladle produce, something like that. And I say, well, hang on a second. Before you start thinking about the modality of what you want to do, think about what you're actually going to do. Think about the learning outcomes. Think about the objectives before you begin, and that's really important. It's important we think about the facilitator. It's important we think about the briefing and the pre-brief, and also evaluating as well, and how we prepare the participants for that experience. The next one is outcomes and objectives, as I've just said, where people come to you and say, let's just do a simulation session on this, on shock or sepsis. And we go into the simulation lab and we just switch the simulator on. That's obviously going to possibly result in suboptimal performance, isn't it, and suboptimal outcomes for students as well. So let's take a step back there and think about the learning outcomes. What is it exactly that we want our learners to achieve by the end of this simulation experience? Always start with your learning outcomes, and then we can work from there. If any of you are in education, higher education, have done a postgraduate certificate, you're probably familiar with John Biggs's model of constructive alignment, where we're thinking about aligning our learning outcomes with our assessment, with our teaching activities, and that's exactly what we should be doing in simulation, is thinking about how we're aligning everything else, assessment and teaching, with our learning objectives. Let's start with our learning objectives first of all. And importantly is making them smart. We're all familiar with the acronym, aren't we? Specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time-phased or time-bound. So not just coming up with an objective, we need to make sure that it is a smart objective as well. Facilitation is how, as facilitators, we facilitate the sessions, and it's thinking about the varied use of methods, but also thinking about that the facilitator has an overall responsibility for that simulation experience, that we're nominating someone who's responsible for the overall experience. And that's how we bring students into the room, that's how we pre-brief them, that's how we run the simulation, that's how we debrief the simulation. There might be other people involved in that, but we need a facilitator that has an overall responsibility to make sure that this works and to make sure it's an effective learning opportunity. And importantly here is someone that knows about simulation pedagogy. This is becoming more and more now, isn't it? Lots of people in the room, probably clinical skills leads or clinical skills trainers, but it wasn't the case. Very often it was people who were just pulled into the sim lab, weren't they? In particular clinicians. Well, you're good at this, you're a senior clinician, come and do some simulation. But that doesn't always necessarily translate to a good educator, does it? So it's important that people have got this preparation in simulation pedagogy. And that's where things like the standards come in, and also programs of education as well. It's thinking about how we prepare the students. It's thinking about cues throughout the simulation scenario, how we provide cues to our learners. So learning doesn't just happen by accident. It's actually being designed by the facilitator. And importantly as well is making things reproducible, isn't it? Particularly if we're using simulation for assessment and high stakes assessment, then it absolutely needs to be reproducible and valid, doesn't it? In that case, the facilitators need to be working together and working, to the same standards. Debriefing, we know that debriefing is really important. We know that that's where students start to construct meaning. So it's really important that our debriefers have got some sort of meaningful framework, doesn't it really? It means that we all know that we're working together. So a debrief should be facilitated by a person competent in the process of debrief. It sounds like common sense, doesn't it really? But it doesn't always happen if we don't think about it. That's the whole point of trying to map our activities to these standards. So it should be undertaken by a person that's competent in the process of debriefing. It should be carried out in an environment that's conducive, and it's thinking about where that might be, and it's thinking about how the sorts of things we foster in that environment as well. Communication, self-analysis, feedback, reflection. And this is another one, isn't it? It's facilitated by a person who can devote enough concentrated attention during the simulation. How many of you, just a quick show of hands, how many of you are both the facilitator and the debriefer in your simulation? And how many people have a separate facilitator and a separate debriefer? Okay, so there's a lot less that do it that way and a lot more that do it the first way. And I guess a lot of that is about resource as well, isn't it? It would be great if we had extra people to be able to run the debrief. But the important thing is that whoever is doing the debrief should have been able to pay enough attention to what's going on in the simulation lab. And that, again, depends on your simulation and facilitation methods, doesn't it? If you're directly involved in helping the learner in the simulation lab, you might miss other things that are going on. So it's perhaps having someone that can stand back and look at the big picture as well. It should be based upon a theoretical framework, and there are a number of theoretical debriefing frameworks. I'm not going to say one is better than the other, but it's thinking about one that fits and one suits for you. And again, it should be congruent with the objectives and the outcomes. So it's thinking about that constructive alignment of your experience again. And there's just some examples of different debrief methods that you can look up for yourself. If anybody wants the references for these later, come and see me, and I'll let you have the references. They're at the end of each standard. Participant evaluation is a really important part. It's an important standard. So whatever we do, we should be evaluating our simulation learning with our students as well. We need to think about what we're going to ask the learners prior to the simulation lab, pre and post. We're going to think about formative evaluation. Again, if it might be we're using simulation for summative methods for final exams, how we're preparing the students formatively as well. And like I've just said, if we're using simulation for high stakes, how are we evaluating that as well? How are we measuring it? Are we using tools? Are we using competency checklists? Again, are we evaluating how the simulation scenario runs, both with the students and with the facilitators, so we can learn from those points that might have come up during the simulation as well. So it's thinking about how we're evaluating our simulation experiences. Professional integrity is a really important one. Professional integrity is not just the professional integrity of the learner or the student, but it's the professional integrity of everyone that's involved in that simulation episode. So that's technicians, that's technical staff, administrative staff, clinical staff that come in and help you on a voluntary basis, and it's the debrief staff as well, the facilitators and the debrief staff. So professional integrity is really important. And this might relate to also such things as the use of video. So if you're using recorded video in your simulations, how are you making that available to learners afterwards? If it's in the public domain, does everyone agree to that? Have they signed a consent form? And what can people do with that video? Is it possible for them to share it with others? If so, do you have a policy of acceptable use? So that professional integrity is both for the learner and for the member of staff as well. It's also things like what do people wear when they turn up for simulation? Do we make them wear a uniform, or can they turn up in their own clothes? What do the facilitators wear? Are they allowed to wear their own clothes, or do they have to wear a professional uniform? So all of these things can relate to the professional integrity and also the fidelity in that case as well. But here we can see things like fostering and role modelling, following the standards of practice for each of your professions as well, and also for your institution. Creating a safe learning environment, and thinking about confidentiality, as I've just said, with the use of video and sharing clinical scenarios as well. Interprofessional education is really important, and some of the most powerful simulation that I've been involved with, that I've seen, is interprofessional simulation. And it's really important that we get it right from the start, isn't it, really, with simulation, with interprofessional education, because there's a number of groups involved, there's a number of different curriculums involved, and it's really important. The planning phase of this is really important. So it's important to sit down and think about what the conceptual framework we're using. It's thinking about where does this fit into people's curriculum. Very often I've seen interprofessional learning that can be tokenistic. So people put on an interprofessional learning day, and because we've got 500, 600 students to get through, well, we can only do 10% of those, due to the very nature of it. So it can become quite tokenistic. So if everybody doesn't get an opportunity or the same opportunity, is that really an effective learning experience? Thinking about the design and development of simulation into professional education. Again, simulation, interprofessional simulation needs to be authentic, doesn't it? And it needs to be valid. If we're putting groups of professionals together, they need to be groups of professionals that are going to work together in real life. Otherwise, they're going to say, well, where's the validity of this? Where's the authenticity of it? And straight away, the learning opportunity potentially has been damaged. Thinking about the potential barriers to simulation to interprofessional education, I'm sure we've all come across some of the barriers to interprofessional education, and that might be just curriculum. If we're doing it undergraduate, the way curricula is designed, we don't meet at the same points. And in the actual fact, if we wanted to do a full simulation program, we'd probably have to stop both curriculums and have a week or 2 weeks where we just bring everybody together. So that can be a barrier. Misunderstanding between professions as well, and just the nature of how professions train. But that it shouldn't be a barrier. That should be a reason for us to work together to do this even more. And importantly, is an appropriate evaluation plan, isn't it? And also thinking about not just the acute environment. So where else do professionals work together interprofessionally, in the community, in hospices, etc. So it's thinking about not just the acute phase, but where else can we get people to think about working together. And as I alluded to, was the Society for Simulation in Healthcare's glossary, really. And this has been a big problem in simulation, hasn't it, over, as long as I can remember, that people have got different terminology for the same thing. We've got maybe 3 different spellings of mannequin, haven't we, for a start? So it's things like standardized patients, educators, facilitators, and it can be quite confusing when we're having a conversation with colleagues, sometimes from a different institution 10 miles down the road, when we're talking about the same thing but using a different terminology, and that can arise for confusion. Confusion can arise there. So it's thinking about trying to provide consistent terminology where we're communicating clearly to each other. And that's the thing we're trying to teach our learners, isn't it? That communication is really an important aspect of healthcare. So we should be modelling that ourselves, that we're communicating effectively with our fellow educators. This is a quote. Maya Angelou is an American poet and a civil rights activist. She passed away in 2014, but she said that I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And that's really true, isn't it? That's quite striking that, what the session you did, 2 months ago on sepsis or on shock or anaphylaxis, people might not exactly remember the content that was in it. They might not exactly what you said in that content, but what they will remember is the way you made them feel. So if you facilitated their learning and you felt that they learned from that session, they're probably going to remember it, and they're probably more likely to remember the content of it. But if they felt belittled, or they felt they weren't listened to or humiliated, then clearly that's going to affect their learning, isn't it, really? And that's really important, because simulation is a really potentially powerful tool, isn't it? It has potential powerful for good and effective learning, but it also has potential for destructive nature in people as well, isn't it? So it's thinking about how we make people feel. So really, the reason we should be using standards is making sure that we are giving people an effective educational opportunity, that we're trying to improve patient safety is the ultimate aim, but as educators, we're trying to give people that effective educational opportunity. So arguably, if we're not using standards, how can we ensure that that's taking place? We try and do our best ourselves, but you're not the only person involved in your institution, are you? You're not the only person you might be, but generally you're not the only person that's involved in delivering simulation education. And if you're off sick or you go on holiday, who's going to do it for you? And the person that steps into the role, how are they going to know how it's supposed to be done? So it's really important that we're building in that kind of, well, not just redundancy, but I suppose it's building in that consistency and validity and reliability, isn't it? That we're making sure that we're all doing the same thing, essentially, to the same sorts of standards. So how are we going to do this then, really? So we've got a set of standards. What do we do? Where do we start with that? Do we just, post it on the intranet, or do we just give people a copy of it? Well, we could do to start with. But the important thing is that we start to develop our faculty. It's faculty development, isn't it? So if you've got 6 people, 8 people, 20 people working in your team, however many people, 2 people, it's really important that you develop your faculty. And I guess the question is, and lots of us, particularly in universities, that we don't just have dedicated simulation faculty. In hospital trusts, that might be the case where you've got 2 or 3 clinical facilitators, but you might also bring in external people, clinicians, visiting lecturers, visiting tutors. So the question is, do we have dedicated simulation faculty versus trying to involve everyone in it? And probably the best way is to have dedicated faculty, isn't it? Is to have faculty preparation. So how many people have got a faculty preparation course in your institutions? So if somebody wants to become a simulation facilitator, how many people have got a dedicated course? Okay, so that's about 6 people in the room. I don't know whether people just didn't want to put their hands up or not, but that's about 6 people who've indicated that. So that's not many people, is it? It's thinking about how do people, so people might come into a job and they've got clinical expertise, but how do they know how to be a simulation facilitator? And how do we know that they're applying the best standards? An orientation policy, which comes with that, to make sure that people are orientated to the simulation facility. If you've been a clinician, it's very different, isn't it, coming from clinical practice, coming into education. I know that myself. It's a very different mindset, and you've got to readjust yourself. That there's ongoing continuing education. Again, this is particularly poor, isn't it, in simulation education, that we employ people into clinical facilitator roles, but we don't give them much development, really, in terms of ongoing development, whereas in clinical practice you might be encouraged to go away and do a degree or a master's degree or even a PhD. There are some opportunities coming forward now in simulation education, but there's still very few kind of practical training courses. It's important that we think about formalised debriefing training. As we've said, debrief is really important, but it can be particularly destructive, and it's not done properly. It's going to damage that learning opportunity. So it's making sure that all people that are involved in debrief have got some training in debrief and that are using a shared model. That we evaluate our practice as well, not just with our learners, but with each other. And that really, if we're working with clinical colleagues, which we should be as simulators, that we're sharing that information, not sharing results necessarily of people's performance, but what we are sharing is good practice, and certainly for things like when we're planning simulation scenarios, is thinking about adverse incidents and sort of never events and that kind of thing, and how can we draw that into our simulation design. And the thing is about preparation as well, isn't it? So before you start your simulation programs, is thinking about the preparation. It is possible to use the Inacsl standards and retrofit them to your programs, but I guess if you're designing a new program now, it would be best to think from the beginning about trying to apply those standards, wasn't it? So the first thing to do would be to map the standards across courses and programs. So think about your current courses and your current programs and map the Inacsl standards to those programs. Think about how your facilitation happens. Think about how you start to begin and design your simulation programs. Think about how you debrief. Think about how you evaluate your learners. So all of these things you can be retrofitting to your simulation programs. Not just use them in your clinical simulation labs and your facilities, but to incorporate them into professional education and also into in situ experiences as well. In situ simulation is becoming more important now and more valid, isn't it? That we don't just have the simulation lab, but we take the simulation lab to the clinical environment. And arguably, it is much more authentic and much more realistic because it's in the environment that people will actually be carrying out their work and their practice. But even more so, if we are coming out of that safe environment that is the simulation lab and we're coming into the in situ environment, it's really important that we have clear standards, isn't it, and clear protocols. And that's where this sort of thing comes in with the use of standards. It's utilising our designated personnel effectively. That's both technical staff, academic staff, and clinical facilitator staff as well. And I would really like to see much more, interprofessional working within simulation, not just us asking other professions to work together, but us as clinical facilitators and academics and technical staff is working together much more closely to design simulation. I think it's really good yesterday that you had the track for technicians as well, because that's long been an area that we've kind of neglected, isn't it, really? We've just expected people to go into the room, switch it on, and have that done for us. But if we're going to make that effective, we need to make sure that technicians and the technical staff are an integral part of our team and are using, using our standards and incorporating the standards as well. Making sure that we're looking carefully at our simulation design and using objectives. So again, like I said to you, if people come to you and say, "Oh, I just want to do a simulation on this, on maternal bleeding or sepsis or whatever," take a step back. Let's just have a look at this. Let's start on a piece of paper and think with learning outcomes, think with objectives, and think about how we're going to design this simulation before we take it into practice. Really importantly is making sure that your work is peer reviewed, both internally within your organisation, but also is having a critical friend as well. And typically simulation labs aren't good at this, are they? Because we've generally built up a commercial industry around it, haven't we? Even though it's within the NHS, it's within healthcare, people want to kind of keep their own areas of practice to themselves, for fear that somebody else might steal their ideas perhaps, but also for fear that commercially somebody might go to this centre instead of this centre. But I think we really need to foster more sharing in this, and it's really good. In universities we have something called external examiner systems. So we have to send a portion of our work to an external examiner. They comment upon it, they come into the university, they speak to students, they speak to staff. And I think that would be a really good thing to have in simulation centres, as well as having someone as a critical friend that can come in and offer that. Not criticism, but just a critical eye, isn't it? And saying, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about how this might work? And particularly if we are using simulation for summative assessment, for final exams, for that kind of thing, it is really important that we've got inter-rater reliability, isn't it? That we make sure that, that our first experience that we give to a student at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, the first student that comes through the door, is the same experience as we give to the student on Friday at 5 o'clock who comes through the door. So everybody needs to have the same experience and have the same standards applied and the same assessment standards as well. And that's really important, particularly where you're using summative high-stakes simulation. So that's a place to begin, is start to thinking about how we might map those against your current provision. Speak to the people in your department, show them the standards, sit down and have a meeting about it. If you've got a simulation development group or a committee, take the standards to your simulation development committee, talk about them, but then actively try to map them to your current provision. And you can see, straight away, you'll be able to see where there are gaps in your current provision, potentially, and what you might do, what you might need to do to enhance that provision. How are we doing for time? Take just a couple of questions. Has anybody got any questions you want to ask me? I'm happy to field some questions at the end. If you want to come and find me afterwards, I'm happy to do that as well.
And also have a look at the Inacsl website. They've got some really cool resources on there. Some nice sort of technical things of how to create such lovely things as sputum and vomit and other really cool things.
There's the address, www.inacsl.org. There's my
Or can you just put the other one back here? And abstracts, though, will be opening soon. They always open very early, don't they?
Yeah.
So
this is the current conference that's going on at the moment. Next year's conference, 13th to 16th June, which is in Toronto. Dr. Amio mentioned this morning about the Simulation Fellowship, about Inacsl relationship with CAE, which is the creation of a simulation educators program, which is a 4-day face-to-face program with also kind of online content and supervision.
Yeah, so the whole program is between 4 and 8 months. So there's a mentorship piece running through it.
So if that's something you're interested in, get in touch. We can have a chat about that as well. And there's my email address.
Matt, thank you. Super.
Thank you.
So I'm now going to hand over the microphone.